Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine standing in the heart of Mexico City at dusk, near the great cathedral where bells echo across stone plazas. Now imagine kneeling and placing your hand against the pavement, feeling the warmth still radiating from the day. Beneath your palm, through layers of asphalt and colonial cobblestone, through centuries of forgotten earth, there lies another world entirely, a city of water and pyramids, of canals and floating gardens, of sacred stones and impossible engineering. This is Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital that once held hundreds of thousands of souls, now sleeping in darkness beneath the modern streets. For centuries it was buried, dismantled, built over, and erased from memory. But can a city truly die? Can a civilization that magnificent simply vanish? And what secrets still whisper in the underworld, waiting to be remembered? But before we descend, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Before there was a city, there was water. Imagine, if you will, the Valley of Mexico in the centuries before the Mexico arrived. A basin ringed by volcanic peaks, their slopes thick with pine and oak, their summits often crowned with cloud. At the heart of this valley lay a system of interconnected lakes, and the largest of these was Lake Texcoco. It stretched across the valley floor like a sheet of hammered silver under the high-altitude sun, shallow in most places, brackish in its lower reaches, fed by streams that tumbled down from the surrounding mountains carrying snowmelt and rain. The lake was not silent. Stand on its shore in the hour before dawn, and you would hear the whisper of reeds bending in the breeze, the soft lapping of wavelets against mud banks, the calls of herons and egrets beginning their morning hunt. The air would smell of wet earth and algae, of pollen drifting from cattails, of the faint mineral tang of alkaline water. In the shallows, water lilies opened white petals to the rising light. Fish moved beneath the surface in silver flashes. Ducks paddled through channels between reed beds, and in the deeper waters the occasional ripple marked the passage of something larger, unseen. This was a landscape of transition, neither fully land nor fully water, but something in between. Marshes extended for miles along the lake's margins, soft underfoot, treacherous to the unwary. Islands rose here and there, some natural accumulations of volcanic rock and silt, others mere hummocks of reed and mud that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. The lake levels rose and fell with the rains. In summer, thunderstorms built over the mountains in the afternoons, and the resulting downpours could swell the lake dramatically. In the dry season, mudflats appeared, cracked and pale under the sun, and the waterfowl congregated in the remaining pools. People had lived around these lakes for thousands of years. They fished, they hunted waterfowl with nets and spears, they gathered the eggs of migrating birds, they harvested the algae that formed thick mats on the water's surface. But the lake itself, its treacherous depths and shifting margins, remained largely uninhabited. It was a resource, yes, but not a foundation for permanent settlement. Or so it seemed. In the year 1325, a people called the Mexica arrived at the shores of Lake Texcoco. They were not indigenous to the valley. They had wandered for generations, according to their own histories, seeking a place to call home. They were not welcomed by the established city-states that already controlled the lakeshore and the surrounding fertile lands. They were tributaries, subordinates, perhaps even despised by some of their more powerful neighbours. They had little choice in where they could settle. The prime agricultural land was taken. The solid ground was claimed. What remained were the islands in the lake, small and seemingly unpromising, surrounded by water and marsh. But the Mexica looked at those islands and saw not limitation, but possibility. Where others saw barrier, they saw protection. Where others saw scarcity, they saw abundance. The lake teemed with fish, with birds, with resources that could sustain life if one learned to harvest them properly. The water that surrounded the islands would make attack difficult for enemies bound to solid ground. And perhaps most importantly, the lake offered something that could not be taken away by tribute or conquest: space to grow, to expand, to build something new. They chose an island, or perhaps a cluster of small islands, near the western shore of the lake. It was not impressive. Reed and mud, soft earth, water on all sides, but they began to build. They drove stakes into the mud to create foundations. They wove reeds into mats and structures. They learned to read the rhythms of the lake, the seasonal flooding, the channels where water flowed fastest, the shallows where fish gathered. They began to fish not just for subsistence but with system and purpose. They planted the first gardens in the soft earth, experimenting with what would grow in such waterlogged soil, and they discovered something remarkable. The lake's very nature, which seemed at first to be a challenge, could become an advantage. They could build artificial islands, extending their settlement by weaving together reeds and branches, anchoring them to the lake bottom with stakes, then piling mud and vegetation on top until a stable platform emerged. These floating gardens, these chinampas, could be extraordinarily fertile. The constant moisture, the nutrient-rich mud dredged from the lake bottom, the careful irrigation and drainage, all combined to create growing conditions that yielded harvests far beyond what dryland farming could achieve in the same space. So the settlement grew, not in the manner of cities built on solid rock, but organically, expanding outward across the water, island by island, chinampa by chinampa. The Mexica became people of the water. They moved by canoe as naturally as others walked. Their children learned to swim before they could run. They understood currents and depths, wind patterns and seasonal changes, with an intimacy born of absolute dependence. The lake was not their enemy. It was their cradle, their fortress, their garden and their road. This was the birth of Tenochtitlan. Not a myth, not a divine mandate fulfilled in thunder and portent, but a pragmatic, ingenious adaptation to circumstance. A people with no other choice, making the best of what they had been given, and discovering in the process that what seemed like exile might become the foundation of something unprecedented. The early years were not easy. Living on water requires a different set of skills, a different way of thinking about shelter and safety and survival. The first dwellings the Mexica built were humble things, structures of reed and wood lashed together with fibre rope, raised on platforms above the waterline. These were not permanent homes in the sense we might understand them. They swayed slightly with the wind. They required constant maintenance against rot and weather. Water seeped up through the platforms during storms, and the humidity was relentless, causing wood to warp and thatch to mildew. But the Mexica learned. They learned which woods resisted water best, which reeds made the tightest weave, how to angle roofs so that rain ran off without pooling. They learned to coat the bases of posts with a mixture of mud and lime to slow decay. They learned to elevate their sleeping platforms, to dig drainage channels, to position doorways to catch the prevailing breeze and keep interiors dry. These were small victories, incremental improvements, the kind of practical knowledge that accumulates over years of trial and error and is passed from parent to child without fanfare. Food was the constant concern. The lake provided fish in abundance, and the Mexica became skilled at netting and trapping them. They harvested waterfowl eggs in season, caught ducks and geese with ingenious snares and nets. They collected the blue-green algae that formed thick mats on the water's surface during certain months, pressing it into cakes that could be dried and stored. This algae, called tequitlatl, was rich in nutrients and became a staple food, but fish and fowl and algae alone could not sustain a growing population. They needed to grow crops, and for that, they needed land. This is where the chinampa system truly began to develop. The concept was not entirely new. Other peoples around the lakes had experimented with small floating gardens, temporary platforms for growing vegetables. But the Mexica refined the technique into something far more ambitious and permanent. They would create new land where none existed. The process was labour-intensive and required patience. First, they marked out a rectangular plot in the shallow water, driving tall stakes deep into the lake bottom to create a frame. Then they wove branches and reeds between these stakes, creating a kind of basket or raft anchored firmly in place. Next came the filling. They harvested water plants, cutting reeds and lily pads and algae by the armload, piling them onto the woven platform. They dredged mud from the lake bottom, rich with organic matter, and spread it in layers over the vegetation. More plants, more mud, layer upon layer, compacting slowly under its own weight. Eventually a stable platform emerged above the waterline, fertile and ready for planting. But a chinampa needed more than stability. It needed fresh water for irrigation. The lake itself was too brackish for most crops. So the Mexica engineered a system of canals between the Chinampas, channels that could bring in fresher water from streams and springs that fed the lake. These canals served multiple purposes. They allowed canoes to navigate between the growing platforms, transporting workers and harvests. They provided drainage when the Chinampas became waterlogged, and they created boundaries, organizing the expanding settlement into a grid of water and land, geometry emerging from what had been formless marsh. On these artificial islands, the Mexica planted maize, beans, squash, chilies, tomatoes, amaranth. The harvests were remarkable. The constant moisture, the rich organic soil, the careful tending, all combined to produce yields that far exceeded what could be grown on the dry slopes surrounding the lake. A single chinampa, perhaps 30 meters long and 2 or 3 meters wide, could feed a family for a year. More importantly, chinampas could be replicated, multiplied, extended indefinitely as long as shallow water remained. The settlement was not constrained by the limits of existing land. It could grow outward across the lake surface like a living thing, expanding into the water itself. And so it did. Decade by decade, the Mexica extended their city. New chinampas were constructed at the margins. New families built homes on the platforms. The population grew. Children who had been born on solid ground elsewhere grew old on these waterborne islands and knew no other way of life. The community developed its rhythms and routines. Men went out in canoes to fish at dawn, casting nets in the deeper waters. Women tended the gardens, planting and weeding and harvesting. Children learned to swim and paddle, to read the moods of the lake, to know when storms were approaching by the colour of the sky and the behaviour of the birds. Gradually infrastructure developed. The Mexica began to build causeways, solid pathways connecting their island settlement to the mainland. These were engineering achievements in themselves, stone and packed earth laid, atop rows of wooden piles driven into the lake bottom, wide enough for several people to walk abreast. The causeways served both practical and symbolic purposes. They allowed goods to be transported to and from the mainland without relying entirely on canoes. They enabled trade and communication with neighbouring settlements. And they demonstrated that Tenochtitlan, though surrounded by water, was not isolated or vulnerable, but connected, integrated into the wider world of the valley. The early social organisation was relatively simple. There were leaders, yes, but in those first decades they were more coordinators than rulers, men and women whose authority derived from their ability to organise collective labour, to mediate disputes, to remember the traditions and stories that gave the community its sense of identity. There were skilled craftspeople, experts in canoe building and net weaving and chinampa construction. There were the farmers and fishers who formed the bulk of the population, and there was a shared understanding that survival depended on cooperation, on the willingness of everyone to contribute to the maintenance of the platforms, the clearing of canals, the constant work required to keep a city afloat. This was not yet an empire. This was not yet the great Tenochtitlan of myth and legend. This was something more modest and more remarkable, a community learning to thrive in an environment that should have defeated them, building a new kind of city through ingenuity, persistence, and an intimate understanding of water and earth and the delicate balance between them. By the end of the first century of settlement, Tenochtitlan had grown beyond its founders' most optimistic imaginings. What had begun as a desperate foothold in the marshes had become a thriving community of thousands. Chinampas stretched across the shallow waters in every direction. Canals crisscrossed the settlement like veins, pulsing with canoe traffic. Families who had arrived as refugees now saw their grandchildren born into prosperity. But with growth came complexity, and with complexity came the need for order. The Mexica were not building in a vacuum. They were surrounded by the remnants and memories of earlier civilizations, and they learned from them. To the north of the valley lay the ruins of Teotihuacan, a city that had flourished and fallen centuries before the Mexica arrived. Even in decay, Teotihuacan was instructive. Its bones still spoke of a vision that was methodical and grand. The city had been laid out on a grid, its streets aligned to celestial and terrestrial geometries, its temples and plazas arranged according to principles of symmetry and sacred proportion. The Pyramid of the Sun still rose above the valley floor, a mountain of stone and human ambition, and those who climbed it could look out across the landscape and understand that cities could be more than organic accumulations of homes and workshops. They could be designed, they could express order, hierarchy, cosmology. The Mexica took these lessons to heart. As Tenochtitlan expanded, its leaders began to impose structure on what had been organic growth. They planned, they measured, they envisioned the settlement not as it was, but as it might become. The city began to take shape according to a grid pattern, canals and causeways defining rectangular precincts, each block containing multiple chinampas, each precinct dedicated to particular clans or crafts or functions. This was not merely aesthetic. In a city built on water, organization was survival. Canals had to flow properly to prevent stagnation. Causeways had to be wide enough for traffic, but not so numerous that they impeded water circulation. Gardens and living spaces had to be distributed so that no area became overcrowded, no quarter monopolized the best fishing grounds or the freshest springs. The causeways themselves became increasingly sophisticated. The earliest had been simple paths of piled earth and stone, narrow and prone to washing away during storms. But as the city's importance grew, so too did the scale of its infrastructure. Engineers planned new causeways that were wider, more permanent, built on foundations of wooden pilings driven deep into the lake bottom and topped with carefully fitted stone. These causeways ran for miles, connecting the island settlement to the mainland in three principal directions: north to Tepeyac, west to Tlacopan, and south to Coyoacan. Each was straight as an arrow, a testament to surveying skill and centralized planning. Travel along one of these causeways in the late 1400s, and you would witness the transformation underway. The pathway beneath your feet would be firm and level, wide enough that you might walk alongside others without jostling, wide enough even for porters carrying goods on their backs to pass each other comfortably. To either side, the lake would spread out, glittering in the sun, dotted with canoes moving to and fro like water beetles. In the distance, the island city would grow larger with each step, its outlines sharpening, the jumble of buildings resolving into distinct structures, the sacred precinct at its heart marked by temples rising above the general mass of rooftops. But causeways alone did not make a city. The internal organization mattered just as much. The Mexica divided Tenochtitlan into four great quarters, each with its own identity, its own leaders, its own temples and markets and neighborhoods. This fourfold division was not arbitrary. It reflected Mesoamerican cosmology, the belief that the world itself was divided into four quadrants, radiating from a sacred center. At that center, they began to build what would become the ceremonial heart of the city. A vast precinct enclosed by walls, containing temples, priests' residences, ball courts, schools, and eventually the towering pyramid of the Templo Mayor. The population continued to grow, swelled not only by births but by immigration. Tenochtitlan's success attracted others. Farmers from the surrounding valleys, artisans seeking new markets, refugees from conflicts elsewhere in the region, all found their way to the island city. Some came freely, seeking opportunity. Others came as tributaries or prisoners, absorbed into the lower strata of society. The city learned to accommodate them all, assigning new arrivals to particular quarters, integrating them into the networks of labour and obligation that kept the city functioning. Housing evolved from simple reed structures to more permanent buildings of adobe and volcanic stone. The wealthier families began to build multi-room houses with courtyards, raised on platforms of earth and rubble that lifted them above the occasional flooding. Roofs were tiled or thatched. Walls were plastered and sometimes painted. Doorways opened onto the canals, with steps descending to the water where canoes could be moored. The city began to acquire a skyline, a rhythm of rooftops and temple platforms, of trees planted in gardens and smoke rising from cooking fires. Water management became ever more critical. The lake's water was brackish, unsuitable for drinking, so the Mexica engineered an aqueduct, a twin-channeled structure running along one of the causeways, bringing fresh water from springs on the mainland. This was a major undertaking, requiring precise gradients to ensure flow, stone construction to withstand weather and traffic, and a system of valves and reservoirs to distribute water throughout the city. When the aqueduct was completed, it transformed daily life. No longer did residents need to rely solely on rainwater collected in cisterns or water carried in canoes from distant springs. Fresh water flowed into public fountains and the courtyards of the wealthy. By the late 1400s, Tenochtitlan was no longer merely a settlement. It was becoming a true city with all that implied. It had infrastructure and planning. It had social stratification and specialized labor. It had monumental architecture and public spaces. It had a growing population that numbered in the tens of thousands, and it had ambition. The Mexica looked at what they had built and saw not an end but a beginning. The city on the water was rising, and its future seemed limitless. The transformation from island settlement to imperial capital did not happen overnight. It was the work of generations, a gradual accumulation of power and influence that accelerated dramatically in the early 1400s. For the first century of its existence, Tenochtitlan had been subordinate to more powerful city-states in the valley. The Mexica paid tribute to Azcapotzalco, a dominant power on the western shore of the lake. They served in its wars, they provided labour and goods. They were, in the hierarchy of the valley, a minor people occupying marginal land. But subordination breeds resentment, and resentment, given opportunity, can transform into ambition. In 1428, the ruler of Azcapotzalco died, and succession disputes fractured the city's authority. The Mexica saw their chance. They had been building alliances quietly, cultivating relationships with other city-states that chafed under Azcapotzalco's dominance. Chief among these were Texcoco, a sophisticated city on the eastern shore known for its scholars and poets, and Tlacopan, a smaller settlement to the west. Together, these three powers formed what would become known as the Triple Alliance, a coalition strong enough to challenge and ultimately defeat Azcapotzalco. The war was brief but decisive. Azcapotzalco fell, its power broken, its tribute network severed, and in the aftermath the victors divided the spoils, but they did not divide them equally. Tenochtitlan, by virtue of its military contributions and its strategic position, claimed the dominant share. The Mexica, who had been tributaries, now became overlords. The reversal was complete and irreversible. What followed was a period of rapid expansion. Tenochtitlan's rulers, beginning with Itzcoatl and continuing through his successors, pursued a strategy of systematic conquest. They moved methodically through the valley and beyond, bringing one city-state after another into their orbit. Some submitted willingly, recognizing the futility of resistance. Others fought and were defeated. The pattern was consistent. Conquest, followed by the imposition of tribute obligations, followed by integration into a growing imperial network. The tribute system became the engine of Tenochtitlan's wealth and power. Conquered territories were required to send regular payments to the capital, payments calculated according to each region's particular resources and capacities. Coastal areas sent shells and tropical bird feathers. Mountain regions sent jade and turquoise. Agricultural zones sent maize and beans and cotton. The tribute flowed into Tenochtitlan like water flowing downhill, inevitable and constant. Vast storehouses were built to contain it. Armies of scribes recorded every delivery in painted books, tracking obligations and receipts with meticulous precision. But tribute was more than economic extraction. It was a statement of dominance, a visible manifestation of the imperial hierarchy. When tribute-bearers arrived in Tenochtitlan carrying loads on their backs or paddling canoes laden with goods, they enacted a ritual of submission. They approached the city along the causeways, passed through gates guarded by warriors, entered the great plaza before the palace, and there presented their tribute to officials who inspected it, recorded it, and passed judgment on its adequacy. The entire process reinforced who held power and who did not. The military underpinned everything. Tenochtitlan's army grew in size and sophistication with each generation. Warriors trained from youth in specialized schools, learning weapons, handling, tactics, and the complex protocols of Mexican warfare. Battle was not mere violence. It was structured, ritualized, conducted according to rules and expectations that everyone understood. Warriors sought not only victory but also captives, prisoners who could be brought back to Tenochtitlan to participate in religious ceremonies. This practice served multiple purposes. It demonstrated martial prowess, it provided victims for sacrifice, and it terrorized enemies into submission. The empire's geography shaped its character. Tenochtitlan controlled the valley directly, but beyond the mountains its power was more negotiated than absolute. Distant territories retained their local rulers, their own social structures, their languages and customs. What they lost was autonomy in foreign affairs and the freedom to withhold tribute. The empire was not a centralized state in the modern sense. It was a network of subordinate polities, held together by military threat, by tribute obligations, and by the simple calculus that cooperation brought rewards while resistance brought destruction. As the empire expanded, so too did Tenochtitlan itself. The city's population swelled with the influx of wealth and opportunity. Craftsmen arrived to work with the exotic materials flowing in as tribute. Merchants established themselves to facilitate trade. Administrators were needed to manage the growing bureaucracy. The city spread outward across the lake, new chinampas constructed to house new residents, new causeways built to link new quarters to the whole. By the late 1400s, Tenochtitlan was no longer just the largest city in the valley. It was becoming one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that would eventually reach hundreds of thousands. Power concentrated at the centre. The ruler, known as the Tlatoani, resided in a palace complex of astonishing scale. This was not a single building, but a precinct, a small city within the city, containing throne rooms and council chambers, storerooms and armories, gardens and aviaries and zoos, where exotic animals collected from across the empire lived in cages and ponds. The palace was both residence and government centre, the place where tribute was received, where justice was dispensed, where the empire's business was conducted. To enter it was to enter the heart of Mexica power. Yet the Tlatoani did not rule alone. He was advised by councils of nobles and military commanders, men who had earned their positions through achievement in war and administration. Decisions were debated, strategies discussed, consensus sought when possible. The system had flexibility built into it, a recognition that even absolute power benefits from consultation and expertise. This was not democracy, but neither was it simple tyranny. It was a sophisticated political structure adapted to the needs of an expanding empire. By 1500, roughly a century and 3/4 after its founding, Tenochtitlan had achieved something remarkable. A people who had arrived as refugees, despised and landless, now commanded an empire that stretched from ocean to ocean. Their city, built on water and mud and human ingenuity, had become the most powerful force in Mesoamerica. The transformation was complete. The age of empire had begun. Imagine yourself arriving in Tenochtitlan on a morning in the early 1500s, approaching along one of the great causeways from the south. The sun has barely cleared the mountains to the east, and the lake spreads out on either side of you, its surface calm and glittering, catching the light in 1,000 small flashes. The air is cool and carries the scent of water and wood smoke, of wet earth and distant cooking fires. Ahead, the city rises from the lake like a vision, its buildings crowding together, its temples catching the early light, its outlines softened by the morning mist that still clings to the water. As you draw closer, the city resolves into detail. You see the network of canals that divide it, straight lines of water cutting between blocks of buildings and gardens. You see canoes moving along these canals, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, their occupants paddling steadily, going about their morning business. Some canoes carry single individuals, others are larger and laden with goods. The city is already awake, already in motion, and you are about to enter its current. You step from the causeway onto one of the city's main thoroughfares, a broad avenue that runs alongside a canal. The ground beneath your feet is firm, paved with fitted stone maintained with care. To your left, buildings rise, their walls of adobe and volcanic rock, their doorways opening onto courtyards you can glimpse but not fully see. To your right, the canal flows, its water dark and clean, reflecting the sky. Along its edge, steps descend to the waterline where canoes are moored, where people are loading and unloading, where the business of the city unfolds. The rhythm of life here is dictated by water. This is not a city where people walk everywhere. Canoes are as common as feet, perhaps more so. Watch a woman descend the steps with a basket, settle herself in her canoe, and push off into the canal. She paddles with easy skill, navigating the traffic, heading perhaps to the Chinampa gardens where her family grows vegetables, or to market to sell what she has already harvested. Watch children playing along the canal edges, hopping from step to step, calling to friends in passing canoes, as comfortable with water as land. This is a city that has learned to move in 3 dimensions, not just across its surface but along its waterways, using the canals as other cities use streets. The canals themselves are marvels of engineering. They are not natural waterways but carefully planned and maintained channels, dredged regularly to prevent silting, their edges reinforced with stone and wooden pilings. They flow in a grid pattern, intersecting at right angles, creating rectangular blocks of land and chinampa gardens. At major intersections, bridges arch over the water, allowing foot traffic to pass while canoes glide beneath. The system is logical, efficient, a marriage of urban planning and hydraulic management that allows a vast population to live and move and work in what was once open water. Follow one of these canals deeper into the city, and you begin to understand the scale of what has been built here. Block after block of chinampas stretch out on either side, each rectangular garden separated from its neighbours by narrow canals. On these artificial islands, vegetables grow in abundance. You see rows of maize, their stalks green and tall. You see beans climbing supports, squash spreading their broad leaves, chilies ripening in the sun, amaranth with its purple plumes, tomatoes and herbs and flowers. Each chinampa is a small farm tended by the family that lives beside it in a modest house of adobe or wood, and the accumulated production of thousands of these gardens feeds the city. Workers move through the gardens, weeding and watering, harvesting and planting in a cycle that never truly stops. The soil is rich, constantly replenished with mud dredged from the canal bottoms and mixed with organic matter. The water is near, always accessible for irrigation. The growing season is long, the climate mild. Multiple crops can be planted and harvested each year. This productivity, this careful and constant cultivation, is what allows so many people to live in such a concentrated space. As morning advances, the city grows busier. More canoes appear in the waterways. More people walk the streets and causeways. You hear the murmur of voices, conversations in Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, its rhythms and tones surrounding you. You hear the splash of paddles, the creaking of canoes, the distant calls of water birds. You smell food cooking, tortillas on hot stones, stews simmering, the sweet scent of tamales steaming in their cornhusk wrappers. The city has its own perfume, composed of water and earth, smoke and food, flowers and humanity, all mingling together in the warm air. The markets begin to fill. There are markets throughout the city, but the largest is Tlatelolco, in the northern quarter, a vast open plaza where tens of thousands gather daily to buy and sell. Vendors arrive by canoe, unloading goods at the market's edge, carrying them to their assigned spots. The array of goods is staggering. Food from the chinampas and from tribute territories farther away. Fish and fowl, fresh and dried. Pottery and textiles, tools and weapons, jewellery and feathers, medicines and dyes, wood and stone and jade. Everything is organised by type, each commodity in its designated section, so that shoppers know where to find what they seek. The air fills with voices, bargaining and greeting, the hum of commerce conducted in thousands of simultaneous exchanges. This is Tenochtitlan at its height, a city of perhaps 400,000 souls, possibly more, all living on and around and above water, sustained by an infrastructure of astonishing complexity and ingenuity. It is a city unlike any other, built on principles adapted to its unique environment, thriving where others would see only obstacle. The canals flow, the gardens grow, the canoes glide back and forth like shuttles on a loom, weaving the city together, day after day, season after season, year after year. At the very heart of Tenochtitlan, enclosed within a great rectangular precinct surrounded by walls, rose the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. This was not simply a building, it was the axis around which the entire city, the entire cosmos revolved. To understand Tenochtitlan, you must understand this pyramid and what it represented to those who built it and lived in its shadow. The first version of the temple was modest. Constructed not long after the city's founding in 1325, it was a simple platform of earth and stone, perhaps no more than a few metres high, with a wooden shrine at its summit. But even in this early form it embodied the essential concept: a sacred mountain, an artificial peak rising from the water, connecting the earthly realm to the heavens above and the underworld below. The temple was the centre, the navel of the world, and from it flowed all order and meaning. As Tenochtitlan grew in power and wealth, so too did its temple. Each generation of rulers sought to expand and enhance it, building not beside but directly on top of what had come before. They did not demolish the old temple, they encased it, covering the previous structure with a new layer of stone and earth, creating a larger platform, a higher summit. This was done deliberately, with ritual and ceremony acknowledging the sacredness of what lay beneath. The temple grew like a tree, adding rings, each expansion preserving within itself the memory of earlier versions. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1519, the Templo Mayor had been rebuilt 7 times. The final version was massive, a twin pyramid rising some 60 metres into the sky, its base perhaps 100 metres on each side. To stand before it was to feel dwarfed, humbled by the sheer scale of human effort it represented. The structure was faced with carefully fitted volcanic stone, its surfaces plastered and painted in brilliant colours, reds and blues and whites, so that it gleamed in the sun. Twin staircases climbed the western face, steep and narrow, leading to the twin shrines at the summit. Those 2 shrines define the temple's deepest meaning. To the north stood the shrine of Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility, of water and agriculture, of life-giving storms. To the south stood the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, of conquest and sacrifice, of the fierce energies that drove the Mexica to dominance. The dual nature was intentional, a statement in stone about the balance required to sustain civilization. Rain and war, fertility, and conquest, creation and destruction, all held in tension at the cosmic center. The temple's construction was a marvel of engineering and labor. Consider what it took to build such a structure in the middle of a lake. Stone had to be quarried from mountains miles away, transported by canoe and causeway to the city, then lifted and positioned with only human muscle and simple tools. Earth and rubble filled the interior, layer upon layer, compacted and stable. The core was solid, immovable, a mountain of human will planted in water. Around this core the facing stones were fitted with precision, each block cut and shaped to interlock with its neighbours. The staircases were aligned to celestial events, oriented so that on certain days the sun rose or set in alignment with the temple's axis, linking earthly architecture to heavenly cycles. The platform at the base of the pyramid was itself a vast plaza, paved in stone, large enough to hold thousands of people during ceremonies. Around its edges stood other structures, smaller temples, priests' residences, schools where young nobles learned the complex rituals and calendars, ball courts where the sacred game was played, skull racks where the remains of sacrifice victims were displayed. The entire precinct was a self-contained sacred city within the larger urban fabric, a zone set apart by walls and ceremony, entered through gates that marked the transition from profane to sacred space. Climbing the temple was itself a ritual act. The stairs were steep, each step demanding effort, and the ascent was long. You climbed facing the structure, unable to look back, focused on the stone before you and the shrines above. It was a journey, a pilgrimage compressed into vertical space, and by the time you reached the summit you had earned the right to stand in that elevated place. From the top the view was extraordinary, the entire city spread below, its canals and causeways visible as orderly lines, the lake stretching to the mountains, the sky enormous overhead. You could see the world as the gods might see it, ordered and comprehensible, centered on the very spot where you stood. The shrines at the summit were intimate spaces, small rooms that could hold only a few people. They were dark inside, lit by braziers that burned aromatic wood and copal incense, filling the air with smoke and scent. The walls were adorned with carvings and paintings, images of the gods and their deeds, symbols of the forces they embodied. Before the altars stood stone figures, representations of the deities, their surfaces blackened by centuries of offerings. This was where the most sacred rituals were performed, where priests communed with the divine, where the boundary between human and supernatural grew thin and permeable. The temple demanded constant care. Priests lived in the precinct, maintaining the fires that never went out, performing daily rituals, keeping the sacred calendar, interpreting omens and dreams. They fasted and drew blood from their own bodies as offerings. They chanted and sang, their voices carrying across the plaza below. The temple was not a static monument but a living thing, animated by human devotion and labour, its rhythms marking the passage of time for the entire city. And always, at the centre of it all, was the awareness that this was the Axis Mundi, the cosmic pillar. The temple connected the three levels of existence, the underworld below, where the dead journeyed, and where the gods of earth and night dwelled. the earthly realm where humans lived their brief lives, and the heavens above where the sun travelled and the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns. To stand at the temple was to stand at the intersection of these realms, to occupy a place of terrible power and responsibility. The Templomere was more than architecture. It was cosmology made manifest, belief given form in stone and blood and prayer. Beyond the temples and palaces, beyond the grand causeways and the ceremonial precincts, there existed another Tenochtitlan, quieter and more intimate, built from the accumulated routines of hundreds of thousands of ordinary lives. This was the city that woke before dawn, that worked through the heat of day, that settled into evening with the smell of cooking fires and the sound of children being called home. This was the human texture beneath the imperial grandeur. The day began early. Fishermen rose in darkness, moving quietly so as not to wake sleeping families, descending steps to where their canoes waited. They pushed off into the pre-dawn stillness, paddling out toward deeper water where the fish gathered. Their nets were woven from maguey fibre, weighted at the edges with small stones, cast with practiced motions that sent them spreading across the surface before sinking. The wait was patient. The lake was generous but not predictable. Some mornings brought abundant catches, others yielded little. The fishermen knew this, accepted it, understood that the lake gave according to rhythms beyond human control. As the sun rose, the Chinampas came alive with activity. Men and women moved through their gardens, checking plants, pulling weeds, harvesting what was ready. This was careful work, attentive and constant. Each plant required slightly different care. Maize needed its stalks cleared of competing growth. Beans climbed supports that had to be maintained. Squash sprawled and needed space. Chilies had to be watched for pests. Tomatoes required staking. The gardeners knew their plants intimately, could read health in the colour of leaves, predict yield from the density of flowers, sense problems before they became crises. Children helped in the gardens, learning by doing, absorbing knowledge that was rarely spoken but constantly demonstrated. A girl learned to tell ripe vegetables from unripe by watching her mother's hands, by practicing the gentle squeeze that tested firmness, by developing the eye that saw readiness. A boy learned to paddle a loaded canoe by first riding with his father, then helping to steer, then eventually taking the paddle himself and discovering how the craft responded to subtle shifts of weight and angle. This transmission of skill was quiet, almost invisible, yet absolutely essential to the city's continuity. The markets drew people from every quarter. By mid-morning, the plazas designated for trade were crowded and bustling. Vendors arranged their goods on mats spread across the ground or on low tables. Each type of merchandise had its designated area. If you wanted pottery, you went to the pottery section, where dozens of artisans displayed their work, cooking pots and storage jars, serving dishes and ceremonial vessels, plain utilitarian ware and pieces decorated with intricate painted designs. If you needed cloth, you walked to where the weavers displayed their textiles, cotton woven in patterns that identified the weaver's home region, coloured with dyes extracted from insects and plants and minerals. The air in the market was thick with voices, thousands of conversations happening simultaneously, bargaining and greeting, gossip and negotiation. Prices were not fixed. Everything was negotiable, a dance of offer and counteroffer that both parties understood and accepted. The currency was not metal coins but cacao beans, small and portable, valuable enough to matter but common enough to facilitate everyday transactions. For larger purchases, people used quills filled with gold dust, or standardized pieces of copper, or simply bartered goods for goods, cloth for food, tools for pottery. Food vendors sold prepared meals for those who had come from distant neighborhoods and would spend the day at market. You could buy tamales, their corn dough wrapped in leaves and steamed, filled with beans or chilies or bits of meat. You could buy a tole, a warm maize drink, slightly thickened, sweetened with honey or flavored with vanilla. The smells of cooking mixed with the scents of flowers sold for decoration and ceremony, of incense burning at small shrines tucked into market corners, of fresh vegetables and dried fish and the earthy smell of packed humanity. Artisans worked while they sold, demonstrating their skills to potential customers. A stone carver sat with his tools chipping away at a piece of obsidian, shaping it into a blade or an ornament, the sharp flakes falling at his feet. a feather worker arranged brilliant plumes, selecting and trimming, creating the intricate designs that marked high status. A jeweler drilled holes in jade beads with a bone drill and sand, the slow, patient work that transformed raw stone into adornment. These were specialists, people whose entire lives had been devoted to mastering particular crafts, and their presence in the market was both commerce and education, a public display of skill and tradition. In the neighbourhoods away from the markets, life was quieter. Women ground maize on stone matates, the rhythmic, scraping sound a constant background music of domestic life. They shaped tortillas, patting the dough between their palms until it was thin and round, then laying it on a hot comal to cook. The smell of toasting corn was the smell of home, of sustenance, of the daily miracle that turned grain into bread. Children played in courtyards and along canal edges, their games simple but absorbing, involving stones and sticks and the elaborate imaginary worlds that children create anywhere. Elders sat in doorways watching the neighbourhood, offering advice when asked, telling stories to grandchildren who gathered at their feet in the evening. These stories carried history and values, tales of ancestors and gods, explanations of why things were as they were, moral lessons wrapped in narrative. The old were respected not for their strength, but for their memory, their accumulated wisdom, their role as living links to the past. This was the daily rhythm of Tenochtitlan, the ordinary lives that sustained the extraordinary city. It was in these rhythms that the city's true strength lay, in the accumulated labour and skill and care of people whose names would never be recorded, whose faces would never be carved in stone, but whose work made everything else possible. The wealth and power of Tenochtitlan rested not merely on what could be grown in its chinampas or caught in its lake, but on a vast network of tribute and trade that stretched across Mesoamerica. The city was the centre of a web, and along the strands of that web flowed goods and labour and wealth from hundreds of subject territories. Understanding this system is essential to understanding how such a large city could exist in the middle of a lake, how it could sustain not only farmers and fishermen, but also priests and administrators, warriors and artisans, merchants and nobles who produced no food themselves. The tribute system was comprehensive and methodical. When the Mexica conquered a territory, they did not necessarily occupy it with garrisons or replace its rulers. Often, the existing power structure remained in place. What changed was the addition of an obligation, a requirement to send regular payments to Tenochtitlan. The tribute demanded was calibrated to what each region could provide. Coastal areas sent shells and salt, items abundant there but valuable in the highlands. Mountain regions sent jade and turquoise and precious feathers from tropical birds. Agricultural zones sent maize and beans, cotton and cacao. Every territory had its assessment, recorded in painted books by scribes who tracked deliveries with remarkable precision. The logistics of this system were staggering. Tribute arrived constantly, carried by porters who walked for days or weeks from distant provinces, following roads that connected the empire, stopping at way stations to rest and resupply. These men, called tlamems, carried loads on their backs supported by tumplines across their foreheads, bearing as much as 60 or 70 pounds, sometimes more. They walked in long lines, hundreds of them arriving together, their loads carefully tallied and recorded upon arrival in the capital. The goods were stored in vast warehouses built for this purpose, some located near the palace, others distributed throughout the city. The scale of accumulation was immense. In a single year, Tenochtitlan might receive hundreds of thousands of cotton mantles, countless tons of maize and beans, thousands of jars of honey, bales of cacao, warrior costumes adorned with feathers, and much more. But tribute was only part of the story. Trade was equally important, and it operated on different principles. Merchants, called Pochteca, formed their own distinct class within Mexican society. They were not nobles by birth, yet they accumulated wealth that sometimes rivaled that of the aristocracy. They organised long-distance trading expeditions, travelling in armed caravans to distant regions, sometimes even beyond the borders of the empire. They traded for luxury goods, jaguar pelts and quetzal feathers from the lowlands, obsidian from volcanic regions, amber and jade, rubber and rare woods. These goods were not tribute extracted by force, but commodities acquired through negotiation and exchange. The Pochteca had their own quarters in Tenochtitlan, their own temples, their own patron deities. They operated with considerable autonomy, and their expeditions served purposes beyond commerce. They gathered intelligence, mapped territories, identified resources, and reported back to the Tlatoani on the political situations in distant lands. In this sense, they were both merchants and spies, their trading missions providing information that could later inform military campaigns or diplomatic initiatives. All of this wealth, both tribute and trade goods, flowed toward the center, toward the palace complex that housed the ruler and his administration. The palace of Moctezuma II, who ruled when the Spanish arrived, was not a single building, but a sprawling compound covering several acres. It contained hundreds of rooms arranged around multiple courtyards, creating a maze-like interior that reflected the complexity of imperial governance. Some rooms served as throne rooms and council chambers, where the Tlatoani met with advisors and heard petitions. Others were offices where scribes maintained records, where judges dispensed justice, where military commanders planned campaigns. Still others were residential, housing not only the ruler and his immediate family but also servants, guards, and the many nobles who attended court. The palace also contained storerooms where tribute goods were kept, armories filled with weapons, workshops where craftsmen produced luxury items for the elite, and even gardens and aviaries where exotic plants and animals were maintained. Foreign visitors who saw the palace were invariably impressed, not merely by its size but by its organization and refinement. Everything had its place. Rooms were designated for specific functions. Access was controlled. Protocols governed who could enter which spaces and under what circumstances. The palace was a physical manifestation of hierarchy and order. The administration required to manage all this was extensive. Scribes recorded every delivery of tribute, every judgment rendered, every distribution of goods, every military campaign. Their books, painted on paper made from beaten bark or on stretched deerskin, were filled with glyphs and pictures that documented the empire's business. These were not primitive records. They were sophisticated documents that conveyed complex information about quantities, qualities, dates, and obligations. Scribes trained for years to master the writing system, learning hundreds of glyphs and the conventions for combining them to express ideas. At the top of this pyramid of power sat the Tlatoani, the speaker, the ruler, whose word carried the weight of law. But he did not rule alone or arbitrarily. He was advised by councils of nobles and experienced administrators. Major decisions were discussed, debated, subjected to scrutiny by men who had proven their competence in war or governance. The system had flexibility, room for persuasion and argument, recognition that even concentrated power benefits from counsel and expertise. When military campaigns were planned, commanders voiced their opinions. When tribute assessments were set, administrators who understood regional capacities contributed their knowledge. The Tlatoani listened, weighed options, then decided. This was how empire functioned in practice. Not through chaos or simple tyranny, but through systems, through record-keeping and distribution networks, through specialized roles and accumulated expertise. It was complex and sophisticated, adapted over generations to manage the challenges of controlling vast territories from a single urban center. And it worked remarkably well for nearly 2 centuries. Religion was not separate from daily life in Tenochtitlan. It was woven into every act, every decision, every moment of existence. The Mexica lived in a universe that was alive, animated by forces that required constant attention and negotiation. The gods were not distant abstractions but active presences, beings whose needs and moods shaped the world. To understand the city, you must understand this cosmology, this way of seeing reality that was fundamentally different from the worldview that would eventually replace it. The universe, as the Mexica conceived it, was layered and interconnected. There were 13 levels of heaven above the earth, 9 levels of underworld below. The earth itself was a thin disk floating on primordial waters, always at risk of dissolution, always requiring maintenance and renewal. Time was not linear but cyclical, moving through repeating ages, each age ending in cataclysm and rebirth. The Mexica believed they lived in the 5th age, the 5th sun, and they knew that this age too would end, though they did not know when. The gods themselves embodied natural forces and cosmic principles. Tlaloc, dwelling in his shrine atop the northern face of the Templo Mayor, controlled rain and storm, fertility and agricultural abundance. His domain was water in all its forms, from the gentle rains that nourished crops to the violent downpours that could flood fields and destroy homes. He was necessary but dangerous, life-giving but potentially destructive. To honour him was to acknowledge dependence on forces beyond human control, to seek favour while recognising that favour could never be guaranteed. Huitzilopochtli in the southern shrine represented different energies. He was the sun, the warrior, the patron deity of the Mexica themselves, the force that drove their expansion and sustained their dominance. His mythology told of constant struggle, of daily battles against the forces of darkness that sought to extinguish the sun. Each dawn was a victory that had to be won again, each day a reprieve that required support and sustenance. The Mexica saw themselves as participants in this cosmic struggle, their own wars echoing and enabling the celestial battles that kept the universe functioning. The dual nature of the Templo Mayor, with its twin shrines, expressed a fundamental understanding of balance. Life required both rain and sun, fertility and war, creation and destruction. Neither principle could exist alone. They were complementary opposites, held in tension, and the health of the cosmos depended on maintaining their relationship. Ceremonies honoured both deities, offerings were made to both, and the rhythms of the ritual calendar ensured that neither was neglected. Central to this worldview was the concept of reciprocity. The gods had created the world and humanity through their own sacrifice. In one myth, the gods gathered at Teotihuacan and threw themselves into a fire to become the sun and moon, giving their own substance to set the cosmos in motion. This act of divine sacrifice created a debt that humans were obligated to repay. The gods had given life, and life must be given back. Without this reciprocal exchange, the universe would falter, the sun would cease its journey, the rains would fail, and creation itself would collapse into chaos. This belief shaped the practice that most disturbs modern sensibilities, the offering of human blood and lives to the gods. It is important to understand this not as cruelty or barbarism, but as cosmological necessity, at least from the perspective of those who practiced it. The sacrifice was not punishment or entertainment, it was sustenance, a feeding of the divine forces that kept existence possible. The blood offered on the temple summit was sacred, precious, the most valuable substance humans could give because it carried life itself. The ceremonies were elaborate and followed precise protocols developed over centuries. They were public, events witnessed by crowds gathered in the plaza below the temple, and they served multiple functions. They reinforced social hierarchy, with the elite controlling access to the sacred spaces and the conduct of rituals. They marked time, organising the year into festivals dedicated to different deities and aspects of the agricultural and solar cycles. They created collective identity, moments when the entire city participated in shared acts of devotion and renewal. And they inspired awe, demonstrating the power of the priesthood and the rulers who commanded such spectacles. The ritual calendar was complex, combining a solar year of 365 days with a sacred cycle of 260 days. These two cycles meshed like gears, creating patterns that repeated every 52 years. The end of each 52-year period was a moment of particular anxiety, when it was believed the world might end if the rituals were not performed correctly. At these times, fires throughout the valley were extinguished, and a new fire was kindled on a mountaintop, then carried to temples and homes, symbolizing the renewal of time and the continuation of the world. Beyond the grand ceremonies, religion infused daily life in smaller ways. Household shrines held images of gods and ancestors. Parents taught children prayers and offered small sacrifices of food and incense. Farmers prayed before planting, asking for rain and fertility. Fishermen made offerings before setting out on the lake. Illness was treated not only with herbs and practical remedies, but with prayers and rituals to appease the gods who might have caused the affliction. Dreams were interpreted as messages from the divine realm. Omens were read in the flight of birds, the movement of clouds, unusual events. The priests who maintained this system lived lives of discipline and austerity. They fasted regularly, abstained from sexual relations, drew blood from their own bodies with thorns and knives, kept vigils through the night, maintained the sacred fires. Their role was to mediate between human and divine, to interpret the will of the gods, to ensure that rituals were performed correctly and at the proper times. They were scholars too, keepers of the calendar, observers of the stars, students of the old books that recorded mythologies and histories. Their knowledge was specialized and guarded, passed from teacher to student within temple schools. This was the spiritual architecture of Tenochtitlan, the invisible framework that gave meaning to the visible city. It was a worldview that saw human life as part of a larger cosmic drama, where every act had significance, where obligations flowed upward to the divine and downward from it, where balance was always precarious and had to be constantly maintained through attention, devotion, and sacrifice. For all its ingenuity and grandeur, Tenochtitlan rested on a foundation that was, in the most literal sense, unstable. The very qualities that had made the lake attractive to the first Mexica settlers, the water and mud that could be transformed into chinampas and gardens, also imposed constraints that would grow more pressing as the city expanded. Every structure built on these artificial islands, every stone pyramid and palace, every causeway and aqueduct, pressed down on sediments that were fundamentally soft, compressible, prone to shifting. This was a challenge the Mexica understood and managed, but it was never fully solved, never rendered completely safe. The problem began with geology. The Valley of Mexico was an endorheic basin, a valley with no outlet to the sea. Water that fell as rain or flowed down from the surrounding mountains had nowhere to go except into the lakes. Over millennia, sediments accumulated on the lake floors, layer upon layer of fine clay and organic matter, creating deposits that were sometimes dozens of meters deep. These sediments were saturated with water, giving them a consistency more like thick mud than solid earth. They would bear light loads, the weight of reed structures and small adobe houses, but they responded differently to heavier burdens. As Tenochtitlan grew and its architecture became more ambitious, the loads increased dramatically. The Templo Mayor was not a light structure. Its core was filled with rubble and earth, its exterior faced with tons of carved stone. Each successive rebuilding added weight, pressing down on the lake bed beneath. The palace complex spread across acres, its many rooms and courtyards all resting on foundations driven into the soft sediment. Causeways, built on thousands of wooden pilings, transferred the weight of stone and traffic to the lake floor. All of this mass, this accumulated weight of empire built in stone, compressed the sediments beneath, causing them to compact, to squeeze out water, to settle. Subsidence, the gradual sinking of structures into the ground, was an ongoing concern. Buildings that had been level when constructed developed tilts over years and decades. Floors that had once been at the same height as doorways sank below them. Canal edges that had been carefully graded to ensure proper water flow became uneven, disrupting drainage. The Mexica responded with constant maintenance, releveling floors, rebuilding foundations, adjusting and repairing. This work was never finished. It was a permanent feature of urban life, an acknowledgement that the city existed in a state of slow, perpetual transformation. Water management became increasingly complex as the city grew denser. The natural flow of water through the lake system was disrupted by the expansion of chinampas and the construction of causeways. Causeways acted as dams, impeding circulation, creating zones where water could stagnate. Without careful planning, some areas would have too much water, flooding regularly, while others would have too little, their canals becoming choked with silt and debris. The Mexica engineered solutions, constructing sluice gates and channels that could be opened or closed to regulate flow, dredging canals on regular schedules, maintaining the delicate balance between water and land. Flooding was a persistent threat. The lake's level rose and fell with seasonal rains and with longer-term climate patterns. Unusually wet years could cause the lake to overflow, inundating low-lying areas, turning streets into canals, filling houses with water. The city had experienced major floods in its history, events that required massive efforts to recover from, years of rebuilding and repair. Defensive measures were taken. Dikes were constructed to control water levels, earthen barriers that could hold back the lake when it rose too high. But these were expensive to build and maintain, and they altered the lake's ecology in ways that created new problems even as they solved old ones. The paradox was fundamental. The city's greatness rested on its ability to manipulate water, to create land where none had existed, to harness the lake's resources. But this same manipulation made the city vulnerable. The more extensive the chinampas, the more restricted the water flow, The heavier the buildings, the more the foundations settled. The larger the population, the more pressure on the water supply, which had to be brought in through aqueducts because the lake itself was too brackish for drinking. Every solution generated new challenges. Every adaptation required further intervention. The city was locked in a continuous negotiation with its environment, managing contradictions that could never be fully resolved. There were also signs, subtle but present, that the lake ecosystem itself was under strain. The fish populations that had seemed inexhaustible were showing signs of depletion in some areas. The water birds that had once darkened the sky during migrations were less numerous, their nesting sites disrupted by human expansion. The water quality in some canals had declined, particularly in densely populated areas where household waste and manufacturing runoff accumulated. The Mexica adapted, fishing in different locations, hunting in more distant wetlands, accepting that the abundance of earlier times could not be sustained indefinitely at the same level. None of this meant the city was on the verge of collapse. The Mexica were skilled environmental managers, and they responded to these challenges with characteristic ingenuity. But the challenges were real and growing. The fundamental tension between urban growth and ecological sustainability was becoming more apparent with each generation. The city at its height was magnificent, but it was also increasingly precarious, its continued existence dependent on constant vigilance, constant maintenance, constant adaptation to the constraints of building a metropolis in the middle of a lake. This was the environmental reality beneath the imperial splendour, the quiet strain that most residents probably noticed. Only in small ways, a building that needed more frequent repairs, a canal that had to be dredged more often, a fishing ground that no longer yielded as generously. The system still worked, but it required more effort to keep it working. The foundation remained soft, the water restless, the balance delicate. The empire's success created its own tensions. As Tenochtitlan grew wealthier and more powerful, as its population swelled and its appetite for luxury goods increased, the demands placed on subject territories intensified. The tribute system that had begun as a pragmatic arrangement gradually became more extractive, more burdensome, more likely to generate resentment in the regions that sustained the capital's prosperity. This was not immediately visible in the daily life of Tenochtitlan itself, where tribute arrived as a given, as natural as rain or sunrise. But in the distant valleys and coastal plains where that tribute was gathered, the weight was felt more acutely. Consider the perspective of a farmer in a tributary province, perhaps several days' walk from Tenochtitlan. His community had been conquered decades earlier, incorporated into the empire, and now, every year, a portion of what his family produced went not to their own use, but to the capital. The local rulers, who remained in their positions, were responsible for collecting and delivering this tribute. They in turn placed the burden on the common people, the farmers and artisans who actually produced the goods. This man worked his fields, cultivated his crops, and when harvest came, a portion was set aside, loaded onto the backs of porters, and sent away. He saw his labour disappearing down the road, sustaining people he would never meet, building temples he would never see, feeding an army that might one day march through his region again if tribute was deemed insufficient. The inequalities within Tenochtitlan itself were equally stark, though perhaps more subtle in their daily manifestations. The city was rigidly stratified. At the top were the nobles, the Pipiltin, descendants of the ruling lineage and distinguished warriors who owned land and received tribute from their own subordinate territories. They lived in large houses, wore elaborate clothing decorated with feathers and precious stones, ate foods that common people rarely tasted. They had access to education in the Kalmakak, the elite schools where future administrators and priests were trained. Their lives were lives of relative comfort and considerable power. Below them were the commoners, the Makahultin, who formed the bulk of the population. These were the farmers tending chinampas, the artisans in their workshops, the porters carrying loads, the market vendors, the fishermen, the countless workers whose labour sustained the city. They lived in smaller houses, wore simpler clothing of undyed cotton or maguey fibre, ate primarily maize and beans and vegetables, with meat and cacao reserved for special occasions. Their children might learn to read and write in the Telpchkali, the common schools, but their education was more limited, more focused on practical skills and military training than on the scholarly pursuits that occupied noble youth. And below the commoners were others whose status was more precarious still. There were the Mayek, labourers bound to the land of nobles, not quite slaves but not entirely free, their obligations hereditary. There were the Tlacoten, individuals who had sold themselves or been sold into servitude to pay debts, whose status was temporary, but whose lives during that servitude were constrained and difficult. There were the prisoners of war who had not been sacrificed, who instead worked as labourers, their fate uncertain, their previous identities stripped away. This hierarchy was not hidden or subtle. It was expressed in clothing, in diet, in housing, in speech patterns, in the protocols that governed who could enter which spaces and who must step aside when nobles passed. The system was justified through ideology, through narratives that attributed status to divine will and ancestral merit, but it was maintained through more concrete mechanisms: control of land and tribute, monopolies on luxury goods, legal codes that punished transgressions of social boundaries, and ultimately the threat of force. The vast majority of the wealth that flowed into Tenochtitlan through tribute did not benefit the city's population equally. It concentrated at the top. The nobles and priests consumed luxury goods, wore jaguar pelts and quetzal feathers, drank cacao, lived in spacious compounds. The commoners received little direct benefit from the empire's wealth. Their standard of living improved only to the extent that the city's overall prosperity created opportunities for skilled craftsmen or successful merchants. For most, life remained a matter of hard work, modest comfort, and limited horizons. This created a social structure that, while stable in the short term, contained seeds of potential instability. The burden of maintaining the empire fell disproportionately on those least able to bear it. The farmers in tributary provinces, the commoners in the city itself, they were the ones who produced the food, who built the structures, who served in the armies, who bore the costs of imperial expansion. The benefits flowed upward. The risks and efforts flowed downward. There were mechanisms for social mobility, but they were limited. A commoner could rise through military achievement, capturing enemies in battle, earning titles and rewards, perhaps even receiving land and elevation to the nobility. But such opportunities were available to relatively few, and they required not just skill but also luck, survival in a context where death was commonplace. For most commoners, their status was fixed at birth, and while they might achieve modest prosperity within their station, they could not transcend it. The system also relied heavily on external resources. Tenochtitlan could not feed itself from its Chinampas alone. The city's population had grown too large. It depended on tribute of maize and beans from agricultural regions, on trade goods from distant territories, on materials that did not exist in the valley. This dependence created a vulnerability. If tributary regions rebelled or withheld tribute, if trade routes were disrupted, if harvests failed in key supply regions, the city would face shortages. The empire had to be maintained not just through military might, but through constant attention to the networks that sustained the capital's consumption. These were not crises, not immediate threats. The system functioned. The tribute arrived. The hierarchies held. But there was a brittleness beneath the surface, a recognition among at least some observers that the structure was less stable than it appeared, that resentments were building, that dependencies were accumulating, that the balance between what the empire extracted and what it provided in return was tilting in ways that might eventually prove unsustainable. By the early 1500s, careful observers might have noticed subtle changes in the lake, signs so gradual that they were easy to dismiss or attribute to natural variation. The water levels, which had always fluctuated with the seasons and the years, seemed to be following a different pattern. In some areas, the lake appeared to be receding, exposing mudflats that had previously been submerged. Wetlands that had once been lush with reeds and water plants showed signs of drying, their vegetation sparser, their channels shallower. These were not dramatic transformations. They unfolded over years and decades, visible only to those who paid close attention, who remembered how things had been a generation earlier. The causes were complex and interconnected. The extensive network of chinampas had altered the lake's hydrology in ways that were not immediately apparent when each individual garden was constructed. Thousands of artificial islands meant less open water, reduced circulation, changed evaporation patterns. The causeways, for all their utility as transportation corridors, also functioned as barriers, dividing the lake into sections that no longer mixed freely. Water that should have flowed naturally now encountered obstacles, creating areas of stagnation where algae bloomed excessively and water quality declined. The aqueducts that brought fresh water to the city drew from springs that had once flowed abundantly, but as the population grew and demand increased, those springs were being tapped more heavily. The water tables in some areas were dropping, not catastrophically, but measurably, and the flow rates were not what they had been. This was noticed by the people responsible for maintaining the water system, who had to work harder to ensure adequate supply, who saw that what had once been surplus was becoming merely sufficient. The Chinampas themselves, though still productive, were showing signs of strain in the most intensively farmed areas. Soil fertility, even with constant applications of lake mud and organic matter, could only be maintained with increasing effort. Some gardens that had once yielded multiple crops per year were now managing fewer harvests. The fish populations in the canals and lake had been exploited for generations, and the largest catches were no longer as common. Fishermen had to travel farther, work longer hours, to bring in the same quantities their fathers and grandfathers had harvested from closer waters. These environmental pressures were compounded by the sheer scale of urban life. A city of hundreds of thousands generated waste, not just human waste but the byproducts of countless workshops and industries. Tanners processing hides, dyers working with mineral and plant pigments, potters firing kilns. All of these activities produced effluents that found their way into the canals. The water's capacity to absorb and dilute this pollution was finite, and in some densely populated quarters, the canals had taken on a different character, their water darker, their smell less pleasant, their suitability for any use other than waste removal increasingly questionable. The ecological changes were matched by political tensions that, while not yet explosive, were becoming more pronounced. The empire had reached a kind of maximum extent. Further conquest was meeting stiffer resistance, not because the Mexica had lost their military edge, but because the remaining unconquered territories were either more distant, more difficult to reach, or more capable of defending themselves. Some regions had been conquered and reconquered multiple times, their populations stubbornly rebellious, requiring repeated military expeditions to enforce tribute obligations. In the territories already under Mexican control there were signs of restlessness. Tribute demands that had once seemed acceptable were now resented as excessive. Local rulers, who had initially cooperated in exchange for recognition and a share of power, were finding their own populations increasingly difficult to manage. They were caught between the demands of Tenochtitlan and the complaints of their own people, and the balance was becoming harder to maintain. Some regions periodically withheld tribute, forcing military intervention. Others complied, but with evident reluctance, creating an atmosphere of tension rather than cooperation. The Triple Alliance itself, the coalition between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco and Tlacopan that had enabled the initial expansion, was less balanced than it had been. Tenochtitlan dominated increasingly, taking the larger share of tribute, exercising more authority, reducing its partners to junior status. This bred resentment even among nominal allies. Texcoco, which had once been a powerful city in its own right, saw its autonomy eroding. Tlacopan was little more than a subordinate. The alliance held because there was no viable alternative, but the goodwill that had characterized its early years was fading. These were warnings, though perhaps not recognized as such by those living through them. They were individual challenges, each manageable in isolation, each addressed with the tools and strategies that had worked in the past. More dredging for the canals, more careful regulation of water flows, more military expeditions to enforce tribute, more administrative oversight. The system still functioned, but it required more effort, more attention, more maintenance to achieve the same results. In the capital itself, most people remained unaware of these subtler strains. The market still overflowed with goods, the temple still rose above the city, the canoes still moved through the canals. Daily life continued in its familiar patterns, but beneath the surface, like the soft sediments beneath the city's foundations, there were shifts occurring, pressures building, small changes accumulating in ways that would only become apparent in retrospect. The lake was not what it had been. The empire was not as stable as it appeared. The balance between growth and sustainability, between extraction and renewal, between domination and cooperation, was tilting in directions that could not be maintained indefinitely. These were not crises, not yet. They were tendencies, trajectories, the early stages of processes that might or might not accelerate. But they were real, and for those with eyes to see, they suggested that the city's golden age might not last forever, that the systems that had enabled such remarkable achievement might also contain the seeds of their own transformation. In the spring of 1519, ships appeared off the coast of what is now Veracruz, carrying men whose arrival would transform everything. They were Spanish conquistadors under the command of Hernán Cortés, representatives of a civilization that was, in many fundamental ways, incomprehensible to the peoples of Mesoamerica. The encounter that followed was not simply a military conflict. It was a collision of worldviews so different that neither side could fully grasp what the other was, or wanted, or believed. This incomprehension, as much as any weapon or disease, would shape what came next. The Spanish brought with them technologies that were unknown in the Americas. They rode horses, animals that had been extinct in the New World for thousands of years, whose size and speed were initially terrifying to people who had never seen anything like them. They carried steel swords and armour, metal worked to a hardness and sharpness that obsidian could not match. They possessed firearms, primitive by later standards, but nonetheless capable of producing noise and smoke and death in ways that seemed almost supernatural. And they brought, though they did not know it at first, diseases to which they had developed partial immunity, but to which the indigenous populations had no resistance whatsoever. But technology and disease, though important, do not fully explain what happened. To understand the transformation of Tenochtitlan, we must understand the religious and cultural dimensions of the encounter. The Spanish were not merchants seeking trade or diplomats seeking alliance. They were conquistadors, conquerors, men motivated by a complex mixture of greed, ambition, and religious conviction. They believed themselves to be soldiers of Christ, carrying the true faith to lands that worshipped false gods. They saw the temples of Tenochtitlan not as sacred architecture, but as abominations, houses of demons that needed to be destroyed. They looked at the elaborate ceremonies atop the pyramids and saw not devotion but devil worship. This was not cynical justification for conquest. Many of them genuinely believed it. The Mexica, for their part, struggled to comprehend what these strange visitors wanted. Initial encounters were marked by mutual incomprehension. The Spanish demanded gold, which to them was wealth itself, the measure of value. The Mexica had gold, used it for ornamentation and ritual objects, but did not value it in the same way. They were confused by the Spanish obsession with acquiring it. The Spanish spoke of their god and their king, concepts that translated poorly into Mexica understanding. They carried crosses and images of a suffering deity, which seemed strange and disturbing. They wore their hair and beards long, dressed in metal and heavy cloth unsuited to the climate, ate foods that seemed bizarre. Moctezuma II, who ruled Tenochtitlan when the Spanish arrived, initially adopted a strategy of cautious engagement. He sent emissaries bearing gifts, attempting to understand these strangers and their intentions. He received reports from the coast, descriptions of the ships and the men, accounts that must have seemed fantastic, almost mythological. There was confusion and debate among the Mexica leadership about how to respond. Some counselled resistance, others urged negotiation. Moctezuma himself seems to have been uncertain, caught between different courses of action, possibly hoping that the problem would resolve itself if handled carefully. What complicated the situation immensely was the political context. The Spanish arrived into a world that was already fractured by resentment and rivalry. The empire the Mexica had built was held together by force and the threat of force. Many of the tributary peoples harboured deep grievances. When the Spanish marched inland toward Tenochtitlan, they encountered some of these disaffected populations, and the conquistadors were shrewd enough to exploit the divisions they found. The Tlaxcalans, who had resisted Mexica domination and maintained their independence through constant warfare, saw in the Spanish potential allies against their longtime enemies. Other groups, tired of paying tribute, saw an opportunity for liberation or revenge. This is crucial to understanding what followed. The Spanish force was small, numbering in the hundreds initially. They could never have challenged Tenochtitlan alone, but they were not alone. They moved through the landscape gathering indigenous allies, peoples who provided warriors, porters, supplies, local knowledge. The force that eventually confronted Tenochtitlan was not a Spanish army, but a coalition, one in which indigenous warriors greatly outnumbered the European conquistadors. This was not Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, but a civil war within Mesoamerica. one in which the Spanish served as a catalyst and a core around which opposition to Mexican dominance could coalesce. Disease began to spread even before large-scale conflict erupted. The Spanish and their Caribbean allies carried smallpox, a disease that had never existed in the Americas. The indigenous populations had no immunity, no resistance, no traditional remedies that worked. The sickness spread through communities like fire through dry grass. People fell ill in their thousands, covered in pustules, burning with fever, dying in numbers that overwhelmed any capacity to care for them, or even to bury them properly. This was not a weapon the Spanish deliberately deployed, though some later saw its effects as evidence of divine favour. It was a biological catastrophe, one that weakened the Mexica and their allies at precisely the moment when they needed their full strength. When the Spanish and their indigenous allies reached Tenochtitlan in late 1519, they were initially received as guests, though wary ones. Moctezuma met Cortés. There were exchanges of gifts, ceremonial speeches, attempts at communication through interpreters. The Spanish were housed in one of the palaces. They walked through the city, their accounts expressing amazement at its size and splendour, its organisation and wealth. But beneath the surface civility, tensions mounted. The Spanish seized Moctezuma, holding him under a kind of house arrest. The situation became increasingly unstable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Two incompatible systems, two fundamentally different ways of understanding the world, had been brought into direct contact. Something would have to give. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted months, from May through August of 1521. It was brutal, methodical and destructive in ways that went beyond the casualties of battle. The Spanish and their indigenous allies cut the aqueducts, depriving the city of fresh water. They blockaded the causeways, preventing food and supplies from entering. They built ships, small brigantines that could navigate the lake, breaking the advantage that water had always given the defenders. Slowly, systematically, they strangled the city section by section, canal by canal, fighting for every block, every building. When the city finally fell in August, it was not the Tenochtitlan that had existed before. Much of it lay in ruins, buildings burned or demolished, in the fighting. The population had been devastated not only by combat but by starvation and disease. Those who survived were exhausted, traumatized, their world shattered. And in the aftermath of conquest came something more permanent and more profound than military defeat. The Spanish set about erasing the physical and spiritual centre of Mexica's civilization. The Templo Mayor, which had stood for nearly 2 centuries as the axis of the Mexica cosmos, became the focus of systematic destruction. This was not accidental damage from warfare. This was deliberate dismantling carried out with purpose and conviction. The Spanish saw the temple as an abomination, a place where what they considered demonic worship had been practiced. They believed that to establish their own faith, to bring Christianity to this land, they had to destroy not just the political power of the Mexica, but the physical manifestations of their religion. The temple, more than any other structure, represented what the conquistadors had come to eliminate. The work of demolition was arduous. The Templo Mayor was massive, its stones fitted together with precision, its core filled with rubble and earth. Indigenous labourers, now working under Spanish direction, were set to the task. They climbed the pyramid with tools, began prying stones loose, breaking the mortar that held them, toppling the carved blocks that had taken generations to shape and position. The twin shrines at the summit were pulled down first, their wooden structures burned, their carved images shattered. Then the work moved downward, layer by layer, reducing the mountain of stone to rubble. Some of the stones were simply thrown down, allowed to tumble and break. But many were preserved, carefully lowered, set aside for reuse. Stone was valuable, and the conquered city had an abundance of it already shaped and ready. The Spanish were practical. They needed to build their own city, and using the stones of the demolished temples and palaces was efficient. So the blocks that had formed the Templo Mayor, that had been carved with images of gods and cosmic symbols, that had been consecrated through centuries of ritual, were repurposed. They became foundations for colonial buildings, paving stones for streets, walls for houses and churches. The greatest symbolic transformation occurred at the site of the Templo Mayor itself. The Spanish decided to build their cathedral there, or rather, just beside it. establishing their own sacred center directly over and alongside the demolished heart of Mexica religion. The foundations of the cathedral incorporated stones from the temple. The plaza that spread before the cathedral was paved with blocks that had once been part of the sacred precinct. The message was clear and intentional. The old gods were defeated, the old faith was destroyed, a new order, a new cosmology, a new authority had been established in its place. The reuse of stones was not simply practical, it was symbolic, violence, a demonstration of conquest that extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of meaning and memory. Stones that had been sacred, that had connected earth and heaven, that had been the focus of devotion for hundreds of thousands of people, now served as building material for structures that explicitly rejected and condemned what those stones had represented. The cosmic axis had been broken. The center that organized Mexica reality had been literally dismantled and reassembled into something foreign and hostile to everything it had meant before. Imagine walking through the construction site in 1522 or 1523, a few years after the conquest. Everywhere you look, there is transformation. The rubble of demolished buildings lies in heaps. New structures are rising, built in Spanish style but using stones that carry the carved remnants of an older world. You might see a wall that incorporates a block carved with a serpent or a star pattern, now inverted or placed sideways, its original meaning obscured or negated. You might see foundations built from stones that were once part of temple platforms, now buried beneath colonial buildings, their sacred character extinguished through burial and recontextualization. The destruction was not total. Some portions of the Templo Mayor remained, buried under the accumulating layers of the new city. The Spanish did not excavate deeply. They demolished what was visible and built on top of what remained. So beneath the colonial streets and buildings, the earlier versions of the temple persisted, entombed in darkness, forgotten but not entirely erased. The sacred stones lay waiting, their meaning dormant, their existence known perhaps to some but inaccessible, removed from the living world. This process of destruction and repurposing extended throughout the city. Other temples were demolished, their stones reused. Palaces became building sites for colonial mansions. The sacred precinct became a Spanish plaza. The careful cosmological organization of the city, with its four quarters radiating from the Templo Mayor, was overlaid with a Spanish grid that ignored the earlier geometry. Street patterns changed. Canals were filled in to create solid ground. The city built on water began its slow transformation into a city built on earth, or rather on the buried remains of what had been water. What was lost was not just stone and timber. It was a way of organizing reality, a framework for understanding the universe and humanity's place within it. The destruction of the Templo Mayor was the destruction of the Axis Mundi, the center that gave meaning to everything else. Without it, the Mexica cosmology could not function. The rituals that had been performed there, the ceremonies that had marked time and season, the offerings that had sustained the gods, all became impossible. The world had been fundamentally disassembled, and in its place, something foreign had been imposed. In the decades following the conquest, a new city rose on the ruins of the old. This was Mexico City, capital of New Spain, a colonial settlement that would grow to rival Tenochtitlan in size, but would be utterly different in character and purpose. The Spanish imposed their own vision on the landscape, their own patterns of organization, their own architectural vocabulary. But they could not entirely erase what had been there before. The bones of Tenochtitlan remained, buried but persistent, shaping the new city in ways that were not always visible but were nonetheless real. The street plan of colonial Mexico City followed, roughly, the causeways and main thoroughfares of Tenochtitlan. This was partly practical. The causeways provided solid foundations, paths of compacted earth and stone that could support traffic. Why dig new roads when existing ones would serve? So the major colonial streets traced the routes of the old Mexica pathways. The causeway that had run north to Tepeyac became a colonial road. The western causeway toward Tlacopan was repurposed. The alignments persisted even as everything else changed. If you could see through time, comparing a map of Tenochtitlan with a map of colonial Mexico City, you would find echoes, correspondences, the ghost of the earlier city visible in the layout of the later one. But in most other ways, the connection to the past was severed. The canals, which had been the city's arteries, its defining feature, were increasingly seen as obstacles rather than assets. They were narrow, they smelled, they were associated with the indigenous past that the Spanish wanted to replace. Over the years and centuries, many were filled in, converted from waterways to streets, paved over and built upon. The city that had moved by canoe gradually became a city that moved on foot and horseback and eventually in wheeled vehicles. The lake itself was seen as a threat, prone to flooding the colonial city, and efforts were made to drain it, to control its levels, to reduce its presence. As these transformations occurred, memory of what had been there before began to fade. The generation that had witnessed the conquest died, and their children, born into the colonial world, knew Tenochtitlan only through stories if they knew it at all. The indigenous population, decimated by disease and displacement, struggled simply to survive in a world that offered them little space or dignity. Their traditions were suppressed or driven underground. The painted books that had recorded histories and rituals were destroyed or hidden. The priests who had maintained the old knowledge died without successors, their learning lost. The very language was under pressure, as Spanish became the language of power and advancement while Nahuatl was pushed to the margins. The stones of the old city, repurposed into colonial structures, became invisible. People walked on paving stones that had once been part of temple platforms without knowing it. They lived in houses whose foundations included blocks carved with glyphs and images, but these carvings were buried, hidden in the walls, their meaning inaccessible. The sacred had become profane, not through any transformation of the stones themselves, but through the loss of the context that had made them sacred. A carved serpent built into a wall upside down and covered with plaster was no longer a sacred symbol. It was just a stone, its significance extinguished through forgetting. For centuries this remained the state of things. Colonial Mexico City grew and prospered, eventually becoming independent Mexico City, capital of a new nation. The city expanded far beyond the original island, spreading across the drained lake bed, climbing into the surrounding hills. The population grew into the millions. Buildings rose and fell, were replaced and rebuilt, each generation adding its own layers, and beneath it all, deeper and deeper, the remains of Tenochtitlan sank into darkness and oblivion. Occasionally, workers digging foundations or trenches would uncover something, a carved stone, a fragment of wall, some remnant of the earlier city. These discoveries were generally treated as curiosities, sometimes preserved but often simply discarded or built over. There was no systematic effort to explore or document what lay beneath. The past was past, irrelevant to the concerns of the present. The city above moved forward, concerned with its own problems and ambitions, unaware of or indifferent to the world that slept beneath its streets. This burial was not only physical but cultural and psychological. The Mexico that emerged after independence struggled with its identity, torn between European heritage and indigenous roots. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the tendency among elites was to identify with Europe, to see the indigenous past as primitive, as something to be left behind rather than celebrated. Tenochtitlan, if it was remembered at all, was often viewed through a lens of exoticism or condescension, a curious chapter in prehistory rather than a significant civilization worthy of serious study. The city above became thoroughly modern, its residents mostly unaware that they walked daily over the remains of a metropolis that had once been among the largest in the world. The cathedral, built partly from the stones of the Templo Mayor, stood as the dominant structure in the central plaza, the Zocalo. Thousands passed through that plaza every day, crossing ground that had once been the sacred precinct of the Mexica, without any sense of what lay beneath their feet. The transformation was complete. The old city had been buried not just physically but in memory, its existence fading from collective consciousness, becoming legend and myth rather than tangible historical reality. And yet stone endures. Buildings can be demolished, canals can be filled, lakes can be drained, but the stones themselves, buried though they were, remained. They waited in the darkness beneath the city, patient as only stone can be, holding within them the evidence of what had been, the carved testimony of a civilization that had built in water and worshipped under an open sky. They waited for someone to remember, to dig, to bring them back into the light. On the 21st of February 1978, workers from the electric company were digging a trench in the heart of Mexico City, just behind the cathedral, in an area that had been part of the old city centre for centuries. They were installing cables, routine work, the kind of excavation that happened constantly in a modern metropolis as infrastructure was maintained and updated. Their tools bit into the earth, breaking through layers of colonial and modern construction debris, reaching depths where the soil was older, more compacted. And then, unexpectedly, they struck something hard. Not a pipe or a foundation, but stone. Carved stone. What emerged as they carefully cleared away the earth was astonishing. A massive circular disc over 3 meters in diameter, carved in low relief with intricate imagery. The stone depicted a figure, clearly female, dismembered and contorted, her limbs separated from her torso, her head severed, arranged in a pattern that was both violent and deliberate. This was not random decoration. This was narrative, mythology rendered in stone. And though the workers could not have known it immediately, what they had found was the Coyolxauhqui stone, a masterwork of Mexica sculpture that had lain buried for over 450 years. The discovery sent ripples through the archaeological community. Scholars had long known that the Templo Mayor had stood somewhere in the vicinity of the cathedral. Colonial accounts mentioned it. Maps showed its approximate location, but the exact site had been lost, built over so thoroughly that it seemed impossible to recover. And here, suddenly, was proof that the temple remained, that its stones and foundations still existed beneath the modern city. The Coyolxauhqui stone was not just a beautiful artifact, it was a key, unlocking the possibility of systematic excavation, of recovering what had been buried and forgotten. The stone's iconography told a story central to Mexica mythology. Coyolxauhqui was the moon goddess, sister of Huitzilopochtli. According to myth, she and her brothers plotted to kill their mother, but Huitzilopochtli, born fully armed, defended his mother by slaying Coyolxauhqui, dismembering her body and casting it down the mountainside. The carved stone depicted this moment of defeat, the goddess's broken body arranged in the pattern of her fall. And its location was not accidental. It had lain at the base of the stairs leading to Huitzilopochtli's shrine, positioned so that sacrificial victims, when their bodies were thrown down the temple steps, would reenact the mythological fall of the moon goddess. The stone was both art and sacred. Geography, mythology made tangible. Work began to excavate the area systematically. Buildings were demolished, decades and centuries of construction carefully removed, layer by layer, to expose what lay beneath. It was slow work, meticulous and patient. Archaeologists moved with precision, documenting everything, photographing and measuring, recognizing that every layer removed was itself part of the historical record. What they uncovered exceeded their expectations. The Templo Mayor had not simply been demolished. Much of it remained, buried under colonial construction, preserved by the very act of being built upon. As excavation progressed, the complexity of the site became apparent. The temple was not a single structure, but many structures, nested within each other like Russian dolls. Each time the Mexica had expanded the temple, they had built over the previous version, encasing it completely. 7 major construction phases were identified, each larger than the last, each containing within it the remains of earlier iterations. The archaeologists could peel back time, examining first the final version that the Spanish had confronted, then working backward through successively earlier versions, each one revealing the temple as it had been decades or centuries before. The findings were extraordinary. They uncovered the twin staircases leading up the pyramid's western face. They found the foundation stones of the twin shrines at the summit, or rather what remained of them after centuries of demolition and decay. They discovered offering caches, deposits of precious objects buried during construction ceremonies, jade and shell, obsidian blades, the remains of sacrificed animals and humans, pottery and incense burners. Each cache was like a time capsule, preserving a moment of ritual, a snapshot of belief and practice from centuries past. The physical dimensions became clear. The base of the final version of the temple measured roughly 100 meters on each side. The pyramid had risen to a height of approximately 60 meters, dominating the sacred precinct. The construction techniques were visible in the exposed walls, cores of rubble and earth, faced with carefully fitted volcanic stone, the whole structure built in stages over nearly 2 centuries. The engineering was impressive, the more so given the challenges of building such a massive structure on the soft lakebed sediments. As word of the discoveries spread, public interest grew. A decision was made to preserve the site, to create a museum that would allow people to see what had been uncovered. Buildings that might have been rebuilt were left demolished. The excavated area was maintained as an archaeological zone. The Templo Mayor Museum was established adjacent to the site, housing the thousands of artifacts recovered during excavation, providing context and interpretation for visitors who wanted to understand what they were seeing. The rediscovery transformed understanding and consciousness. For the first time in over 4 centuries, it became possible to see and touch the physical remains of Tenochtitlan's sacred center. The city that had been buried and forgotten was brought back into the light, made real and tangible again. Memory that had faded to myth was given substance in stone and artifact. The past, which had seemed irrecoverable, proved to be merely hidden, waiting beneath the streets for someone to dig deeply enough to find it. The work of excavation, once begun, continued for years. This was not treasure hunting or rapid exploration, but archaeology in its most careful and deliberate form. Every layer of earth removed was itself evidence, telling a story about when it was deposited and what it contained. Every fragment of pottery, every shard of obsidian, every bone and seed and piece of charcoal held information about the past. The archaeologist worked with small tools, brushes and trowels, screens for sifting soil, notebooks and cameras for recording everything. Progress was measured in centimetres per day, sometimes less. Patience was the primary virtue. As they dug deeper, moving backward through time, the site revealed its history in reverse. The topmost layers were colonial and modern, filled with the debris of centuries of construction and reconstruction. Beneath that came the destruction layer from the conquest and its immediate aftermath, soil mixed with ash and broken stone, evidence of violence and burning. And beneath that, finally, they reached intact Mexica construction, walls and floors and foundations that had remained undisturbed since they were buried in the 16th century. The experience of uncovering these structures must have been profound for those doing the work. Imagine brushing soil away from a carved stone and seeing, emerging gradually from the earth, the face of a deity or the coils of a feathered serpent. Imagine clearing debris from a wall and finding painted plaster still adhering to it, colours faded but recognisable after centuries in darkness. Imagine opening a sealed offering cache and finding objects placed there 500 years earlier, arranged with care and intention, now seeing daylight again for the first time since they were buried in ritual. The artefacts that emerged were numerous and varied. There were monumental sculptures, stone figures of gods carved with extraordinary skill, some weighing several tons. There were smaller objects, pottery vessels painted with intricate designs, obsidian blades knapped to razor sharpness, jewellery of jade and turquoise and shell. There were organic remains, preserved by chance in the peculiar chemistry of the lakebed soil, textiles, wood, even remnants of offerings that had included food and flowers. Each object was cleaned, catalogued, photographed, studied, then carefully stored or displayed. The museum that was built adjacent to the excavation site became a repository for these discoveries. Its galleries told the story of Tenochtitlan through objects, organising them by theme and chronology, providing context that helped visitors understand what they were seeing. Walking through the museum became a journey through Mexica civilization, from its foundations to its height to its destruction. The objects were no longer buried, no longer forgotten. They had been brought back into the world, given a new kind of life as witnesses to a vanished culture. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the site was not what was removed to museums, but what remained in place. The foundations of the Templo Mayor, once exposed, were left exposed. You can visit the site today and stand where the sacred precinct once stood. You can see the stone platforms that formed the base of the pyramid, the remains of staircases, the outline of structures that surrounded the temple. You can look up and see the cathedral looming above, its walls incorporating stones from the demolished temple, the old and new in direct visual relationship. The decision to preserve the site in this way was significant. It would have been possible to conduct the excavations, remove the artifacts, and then rebuild on the site, covering everything over again. This was the pattern that had been followed for centuries, but instead, the choice was made to keep the past visible, to create a space where people could encounter Tenochtitlan's physical remains directly. The excavation became permanent, a wound in the modern city that revealed the older city beneath, a place where time layers were made explicit. Standing at the site, you become aware of depth in a visceral way. The excavated foundations are several meters below the current street level. The modern city towers above, and beneath the visible foundations lie earlier versions of the temple, still buried, nested within each other, layer upon layer descending into the earth. The full history of the site is not visible. Much remains unexplored, inaccessible beneath buildings that could not be demolished, or in areas where excavation would destabilize surrounding structures. What you see is a window, not the whole picture, but it is enough to make the past real. The excavation also continued to yield discoveries even after the initial work was completed. As techniques improved, as new questions were asked, archaeologists returned to the site, excavating new areas, finding new offerings, new evidence. The process of revelation was ongoing, not finished. Each generation of scholars brought new perspectives, new technologies, new ways of understanding what the stones and artifacts could tell them. This site was not a closed book, but an open one, still being read, still being interpreted. What the excavation accomplished, beyond the recovery of artifacts and architectural remains, was a restoration of memory. For centuries, Tenochtitlan had been abstract, known only through written accounts and imagination. Now it was concrete, visible, touchable. The stones that had been buried spoke again. The city that had been erased was partially recovered. This did not undo the conquest or restore what had been lost, but it did affirm that the past, even when buried and forgotten, does not entirely disappear. It persists, waiting. And when the time and will exist to uncover it, it can be brought back into consciousness, made part of the present in new ways. What survives of Tenochtitlan is both more and less than one might hope. More, because the physical remains proved to be substantial once excavation began, yielding thousands of artifacts and architectural features that had been preserved through burial. Less, because what survives is fragmentary, incomplete, a small portion of what once existed. The city at its height covered several square kilometers, housed hundreds of thousands of people, contained countless buildings and gardens and waterways. Of all that, only traces remain, evidence that must be carefully interpreted to reconstruct the whole. The most visible survival is the Templo Mayor site itself, now a permanent archaeological zone in the heart of Mexico City. The foundations are exposed, the base platforms visible, the outline of staircases and structures clear enough that visitors can begin to imagine the pyramid that once rose from these stones. But this is a ruin in the fullest sense. The upper portions are gone, demolished, or decayed. The twin shrines that crown the summit exist only as floor plans, their walls reduced to foundation level. The brilliant colours that once covered the surfaces have faded or disappeared. What remains is stone, geometry, the skeleton of architecture stripped of its flesh. The museum adjacent to the site houses the portable artifacts, and these are often more evocative than the ruins themselves. Here you can see the Coyolxauhqui stone in all its detail, the goddess's dismembered body rendered with artistic skill that is unmistakable even after centuries underground. You can see jade masks and obsidian blades, pottery vessels painted with complex iconography, the remains of offerings that once connected the human and divine. You can see stone sculptures of gods, their forms powerful even divorced from the ritual context that once gave them meaning. These objects speak across the centuries, though their language must be learned. Throughout Mexico City, if you know where to look, other traces persist. Some colonial buildings incorporated carved stones from Mexica structures in ways that left them visible. A serpent carved in stone might appear in the wall of a building constructed in the 1600s, its presence testimony to the reuse of materials from the demolished temples. The cathedral itself, that massive structure dominating the Zócalo, rests partly on foundations that include stones from the Templo Mayor. To enter the cathedral is, in a sense, to walk on the bones of the old faith. The street plan, as mentioned before, preserves ghost patterns. The major avenues of central Mexico City follow routes that were causeways in Tenochtitlan. The grid of the colonial city, while different in detail from the Mexica layout, echoes it in broad strokes. This is not coincidence but path dependence, the tendency of later development to follow earlier patterns because they represent established routes, solid ground, lines of least resistance. The city built on top of the city carries within its structure the memory of what came before, even when that memory is unconscious. Place names offer another form of survival. Chapultepec, the hill west of the city centre, retains its Nahuatl name, meaning Grasshopper Hill. Tlatelolco, once a separate city that was incorporated into Greater Tenochtitlan, survives as a neighbourhood name. Throughout Mexico, thousands of place names are derived from Nahuatl, markers on the landscape of indigenous presence and persistence. The language itself survives, spoken by over 1 million people, evolved from its classical form but still recognisably descended from the language spoken in Tenochtitlan. This linguistic continuity is perhaps the most living form of survival, carried not in stone but in speech, passed from generation to generation despite centuries of pressure to abandon it. But what has been lost is immense and must be acknowledged. Entire neighbourhoods of Tenochtitlan are simply gone, their chinampas filled in or dissolved, their structures demolished without record. The vast majority of painted books, the codices that recorded history and ritual and knowledge, were destroyed during and after the conquest, burned by missionaries who saw them as pagan documents. Of the hundreds or thousands that must have existed, only a handful survived, and even those were often damaged or incomplete. The oral traditions, the songs and stories and prayers that were not written down, largely disappeared with the generations that carried them. The knowledge of how to read the symbols carved on monuments, how to perform the rituals, how to interpret the calendar, was lost, or had to be painstakingly reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. The people themselves, the millions who lived in and around Tenochtitlan, left behind few individual traces. We know the names of rulers and some nobles, recorded in colonial documents. But the fisherman paddling his canoe, the woman tending her chinampa garden, the child playing along the canal edge, the artisan shaping clay or stone, these individuals are anonymous. Their lives were lived and forgotten, leaving no record beyond the collective evidence of their existence, the artifacts they made, the structures they built, the modifications they made to the landscape. They are present but nameless, part of a statistical aggregate rather than known as individuals with particular stories and personalities. What survives, then, is enough to know that something remarkable existed, enough to reconstruct in broad outline how the city functioned and what it meant to those who built and inhabited it. But it is not enough to fully recover the experience, the texture, the emotional and sensory reality of living in Tenochtitlan at its height. That is lost, irretrievably, and we must accept the limits of what can be known across such distances of time and cultural transformation. Yet even this partial survival matters. The stones that remain, the artifacts in museums, the place names and linguistic traces, the memories preserved in scholarship and increasingly in public consciousness, all serve to remind us that the indigenous civilizations of the Americas were not primitive or insignificant, but sophisticated and substantial, deserving of respect and study. The excavation of the Templo Mayor, the preservation of its remains, the ongoing research and interpretation represent a form of reparation, an acknowledgement that what was buried deserves to be remembered, that the past, even when conquered and suppressed, retains claims on the present. Walk through Mexico City today and you move through multiple layers of time simultaneously. The street beneath your feet is asphalt, modern, maintained by contemporary crews with electric tools and machinery. But beneath that asphalt lies colonial cobblestone, laid by workers centuries ago, and beneath that in many places lie the remains of Mexica causeways, the stone foundations that once carried traffic across water. The vertical dimension of the city is archaeological, each layer telling a story, and the weight of all those stories presses down on what lies deepest. The soft sediments of the old lake bed, the foundation that was never quite solid, that remains even now uncertain and yielding. The modern city faces challenges that would be grimly familiar to the engineers and administrators of Tenochtitlan. Chief among these is subsidence, the slow sinking of structures into the ground. Mexico City is sinking, measurably and continuously, in some areas at rates of several centimetres per year. The cause is the extraction of groundwater from the aquifer beneath the city. As water is pumped up to supply the millions of residents, the spaces it occupied in the rock and soil collapse, compacting, and the city above settles downward. Buildings tilt, streets develop dips and rises, infrastructure strains as pipes designed to follow level gradients find themselves at angles, breaking or requiring constant repair. This is not a new problem. It is the same problem the Mexica faced, the same fundamental tension between building on soft ground and the weight of urban infrastructure. The difference is one of scale and mechanism. The Mexica built on lake sediments and dealt with subsidence caused by the direct pressure of their structures. Modern Mexico City has drained most of the lake, removing the water that once helped support the soft sediments and now extracts even the groundwater deep beneath, accelerating the subsidence. The process is similar. The speed and extent are magnified by modern technology and population density. Water itself remains the central challenge, as it was 500 years ago. The lake that surrounded Tenochtitlan is gone, deliberately drained over centuries to prevent flooding and to create more land for the expanding city. But removing the lake did not solve the water problem. It created new ones. Without the lake to moderate climate and provide moisture, the city is drier, more prone to dust and air pollution. The water that once flowed openly through canals and across the lake surface now moves through pipes or not at all, and the supply is increasingly inadequate for the population. Meanwhile, flooding remains a threat during heavy rains because the drainage systems, though extensive, cannot fully compensate for the loss of the natural absorption and storage capacity that the lake and wetlands provided. The parallels to ancient challenges are striking and instructive. The Mexica succeeded for 2 centuries by working with their environment, by understanding water and learning to manage it skillfully. Their chinampas turned water from obstacle into advantage. Their canals provided both transportation and drainage. Their system, though it strained toward the end, functioned remarkably well for a city of its size in that era. But modern Mexico City has taken a different approach, attempting to dominate and eliminate the water rather than integrate with it. The lake has been drained. The rivers have been channeled underground or diverted. The natural hydrology of the valley has been radically altered. And yet the fundamental realities persist. The valley is still a closed basin, water still accumulates, the ground is still soft, and gravity still pulls structures downward into yielding earth. There are lessons here, if we choose to learn them. Tenochtitlan's fate teaches us about the limits of manipulation, the consequences of building beyond what the environment can sustainably support. The Mexica pushed against those limits, and while they succeeded for a time, the pressures were building. Modern Mexico City has pushed far beyond those limits, using technology to overcome natural constraints in the short term, but accumulating problems that become more severe with each generation. The sinking city, the water shortages, the flood risks, these are not failures of engineering but consequences of fundamental choices about how to relate to place, to environment, to the realities of geology and hydrology. Walking through the city, you can see these tensions made visible. Near the Zocalo, the plaza at the city's heart, the cathedral tilts noticeably, its foundations settling unevenly into the soft ground beneath. The building is massive, constructed over centuries using stones from the demolished Templo Mayor, and its weight has caused differential subsidence, one side sinking more than the other. Engineers have worked for decades to stabilize it, but the process continues. The building's tilt is both an engineering problem and a metaphor, a physical expression of the instability that comes from building heavy monuments on yielding foundations. In the neighborhoods beyond the center, especially in areas that were once lake bed, subsidence is even more visible. Houses develop cracks, walls separate from their foundations, streets become uneven, their surfaces buckled and patched repeatedly. Residents learn to live with this instability, accepting it as normal, but it represents a slow-motion crisis, a gradual degradation of infrastructure that will eventually require choices about whether and how to continue occupying these spaces. The story of Tenochtitlan and its transformation into Mexico City is ultimately a story about human ambition, ingenuity, and the limits of both. It is a story about what happens when populations grow beyond what local environments can easily support, about the creativity required to overcome constraints and the consequences when those solutions create new problems. It is a cautionary tale, not because the Mexica or their successors were foolish, but because they were human, driven by the same desires for security, prosperity, and growth that motivate people everywhere. The ancient city beneath the modern one whispers warnings for anyone willing to listen. It reminds us that stone endures, but civilizations do not, that what seems permanent can be buried and forgotten, that the consequences of environmental choices compound over centuries. It suggests humility, the recognition that we are not the first to face these challenges and likely will not be the last, and that learning from the past might help us avoid repeating its mistakes, or at least face its recurring problems with greater wisdom. In the end, what remains is less a story of conquest and destruction than one of transformation and persistence. Tenochtitlan as a living city ceased to exist in 1521. The canals were filled, the temples demolished, the political and religious systems that had animated it were suppressed or destroyed. But cities, like all human creations, exist in multiple dimensions. They are physical places, collections of buildings and streets and infrastructure. But they are also memories, accumulated knowledge, shared identities, ways of understanding the world. And in these less tangible forms, Tenochtitlan never entirely disappeared. The stones remember, even when people forget. Buried beneath the streets of Mexico City, incorporated into colonial walls, lying in museum cases, they carry within them the evidence of what was. Every carved glyph, every fitted joint, every trace of paint or tool mark speaks of the people who shaped them, of the purposes they served, of the world they helped create. These stones are archives, repositories of information that can be read by those who learn their language. They waited patiently in darkness for centuries, and when they were finally uncovered, they testified. Memory persists in other forms as well. The descendants of the people who built and inhabited Tenochtitlan are still present, millions of them, living throughout Mexico and beyond. They carry in their genes, their languages, their traditions, their ways of knowing, fragments of continuity that stretch back through the conquest and colonization to the world before. This continuity is often overlooked or dismissed, treated as marginal to the dominant narrative of European descent and influence. But it is real and substantial. The people did not vanish. They adapted, survived, preserved what they could, and continued. The Nahuatl language, spoken today by over 1 million people, is perhaps the most direct link to the past. It has evolved, incorporating Spanish loanwords and adapting to new contexts, but it remains recognizable as the language spoken in Tenochtitlan. Every conversation in Nahuatl, every child who learns it, every story told or song sung in that language, represents an unbroken thread extending back through centuries to the world we have explored in this narrative. Language carries within it ways of thinking, categories for understanding reality, accumulated wisdom about place and relationship. When the language survives, something essential survives with it. Traditional knowledge persists as well, though often in modified or fragmentary forms. Agricultural techniques developed on the Chinampas are still practiced in some areas, adapted to new circumstances but recognizably descended from ancient methods. Herbal medicine, textile patterns, food preparation techniques, stories and songs all carry forward elements of pre-conquest culture. These are not museum pieces, frozen in time but living traditions, changing and adapting yet maintaining connections to their origins. They represent resilience, the human capacity to preserve identity and meaning even through catastrophic change. The rediscovery of the Templar Mare in 1978 marked a shift in consciousness. It provided physical, undeniable proof of what had been buried and forgotten, making it impossible to dismiss or ignore the indigenous past. The excavations, the museum, the preservation of the site, all represented a kind of cultural reclamation, an acknowledgement that this history matters, that it deserves attention and respect. This shift is ongoing, still contested, still incomplete, but it is real. Mexico, as a nation, is gradually coming to terms with its complex identity, recognizing that it is not simply an extension of European civilization, but a fusion, a mestizo culture that draws from multiple roots. There is melancholy in this story, certainly. So much was lost, so much beauty and knowledge destroyed or allowed to fade. The magnitude of that loss can never be fully measured or compensated. But there is also affirmation. Despite conquest, despite suppression, despite centuries of forgetting, the past proved impossible to completely erase. Memory, in its various forms, persisted. And when conditions changed, when interest and will emerged, that memory could be recovered, at least partially, brought back into consciousness and honoured. This matters not just for Mexico, but for all of us. Every city, every civilization, Every human community builds on foundations laid by those who came before. Understanding those foundations, recognizing the complexity and achievement, and also the failures and tragedies of the past, helps us navigate the present with greater wisdom and humility. Tenochtitlan teaches us about environmental limits, about the consequences of inequality, about the fragility of even the most impressive human achievements. It also teaches us about ingenuity, about adaptation, about the remarkable things humans can accomplish when they work with their environment, rather than simply trying to dominate it. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you will carry with you an image of that buried city, its stones waiting in darkness, its canals long since filled but still traceable in the pattern of streets above, its people long dead but survived by their descendants and their works. Perhaps you will reflect on impermanence, on the way all things change and pass, empires and individuals alike. But perhaps also on persistence, on the stubbornness of memory, on the way meaning and beauty, once created, echo forward through time even when the forms that carried them have dissolved. The city beneath the city whispers still for those who pause to listen. It speaks of ambition and achievement, of balance and imbalance, of what endures and what fades. It reminds us that we too are building on uncertain foundations, that our cities and systems may seem permanent but are not, that humility and attention to environmental and social balance are not optional luxuries but necessities, and it offers, in its very survival through burial and rediscovery, a kind of hope. The past, even when buried, waits, memory persists, and human creativity, human resilience, human meaning making continues across the centuries, connecting us all in a long conversation that began before we arrived and will continue after we depart. Rest now, knowing that the stones remember, that stories endure, that beneath the surface of our busy present lies depth and history and connection to all who came before. Sleep well.